Chapter 3, The Daily Life of the Monks, Part 2. 3. The Church. The essential purpose for which Fountains Abbey was founded was the pursuit of religion. The prevailing interpretation which was put upon religion made it to consist, in great measure, of the saying of services. Out of the confused noises of the common street, the monks had retired into the quiet of the monastery in the hope of meeting God, and they sought God in the church. The church had a western porch, 12 feet in width, extending along the whole front. Part of the porch floor was made of gravestones, beneath which lay the dust of devout laymen who had begged the privilege of being buried at the door of the house of prayer. The porch roof touched the base of the great window, which was filled with the glorious colors of the inimitable glass of the Middle Ages. Over the window, in a niche, was a figure of the mother and child. Abbot John Darnton had this made, and inscribed his name upon the supporting corbel. An eagle, the symbol of the fourth evangelist, to mean John, perched on a cask, or tun, with a scroll beneath marked Durn 1494. Entering beneath the Norman arch of the west door, the visitor found over his head a gallery which carried the great organ. A screen supported the gallery, making a vestibule for the church, keeping out the wind. A fragment of the base of this screen remains on the south side, near a bit of pavement which was put in by John of Kent. Standing in the screen door and looking to the east, the high roof reached over the nave, the choir, the presbytery, and the chapel of the 9 altars, to the splendor of the east window. The Norman nave and transepts, with their great pillars and round-headed clear-story windows, represent the primitive Puritan simplicity of the Cistercians. The choir and presbytery and the 9 altars chapel are in the style called Early English. The great windows, east and west, replacing plainer windows, are, like the tower, in the style called Perpendicular. Today, by the destruction of the choir and presbytery, the whole church, in its great length, lies open to the view, but in the Middle Ages it was crossed by 3 stone screens. The first partition, called the Rood screen, crossed the middle alley between the 7th pair of pillars, counting from the west door. It had 2 openings, between which stood an altar. Over the altar, on a beam which topped the screen from pillar to pillar, was a great cross, or rood. This screen formed the east end of that part of the church which was assigned to the lay brothers. On the right hand and on the left, this sanctuary was shut off from the aisles by walls which ran along the inner side of the pillars, making a long, narrow chapel, with the stalls of the lay brothers set against them. Thus the pillars were hidden in the aisles, an observer at the west door seeing only the capitals and upper portions of them above the walls. The second partition, called the choir screen, crossed the 10th pair of pillars, and a door in the middle of it gave access to the choir. The space between these 2 screens, called the retro choir, was intended especially for aged and convalescent brethren from the infirmary. There was probably a great bench for them against the back of the Rood screen. In the midst of the retro choir, between the 8th and 9th pairs of pillars, stood 2 altars, one on the north, dedicated to St. Mary, and the other on the south, dedicated to St. Bernard. The rear dosses of these altars made a screen between the 9th pillars, having a doorway between them. In this passage, between the altars of the saints, 3 abbots were buried in the 15th century. From the top of the 2 rear dosses to the top of the choir screen, a loft was built, called the pulpitum, extending from the 9th and 10th pillars on the north to the 9th and 10th pillars on the south, and on the north side carried out over the aisle. Here, over the aisle, stood the choir organ. Passing under this gallery, through the door of the choir screen, the visitor stood in the central sanctuary, the church of the monks of the cloister. On either side were 20 stalls, and against the screen, facing the east, were 3 stalls on the right of the entrance and 3 on the left. The number of the stalls is determined by the discovery of 9 earthen pots buried in the masonry which underlay them. These pots were, no doubt, as in several other churches, an acoustic experiment. The distances between them indicate how many there were in the whole range. In front of the stalls of the monks were lower seats for the novices. In addition to the entrance through the choir screen, there were 2 other ways of access, at the east end of the stalls on either side. Here is still on either side a stone step, significantly worn. On the north side, stairs led to a high seat over the door. In the middle alley, where the lectern may have stood at which the lessons were read at matins, an abbot was buried. The presbytery, or chancel, began at these choir doors and was raised a step or 2. Across the long space of its shining floor stood the 3rd partition, called the altar screen. Against it was the high altar. Thus the church was divided into 3 churches, one for the brothers of the cellarium, ending at the rood screen, one for the infirmary brethren, ending at the choir screen, one for the brethren of the cloister, ending at the altar screen. On the 2 sides of this 3-fold sanctuary ran long aisles, from the west wall to the chapel of the 9 altars. In the middle of this distance, the aisles opened into transepts north and south. The nave aisles, at first unobstructed for passage around the church, were presently cut up by cross partitions into chapels, but the choir aisles continued to be used as ambulatories. The transepts served as antechambers for the chapels which opened out from them to the east. Each transept had originally 3 of these chapels, but the building of the new chancel had taken away the inner one on each side. Of the 2 which thus remained, the outer chapel of the north transept had been changed into a storehouse when the tower was built, so that only the chapel which was in the middle remained. Over the door, under a bracket, is still to be read an inscription which informs us that it was dedicated to the Archangel Michael. The north transept ended in the noble tower of 4 stories, the 3rd of which was probably for the bells, whilst the 2nd may have served as the sleeping room of the men who rung them. The inscriptions which ran around the outside of the tower are still in great part legible. "Blessed be the name of Jesus Christ," said the stones above. "Blessing and wisdom and honor and power be to our God forever. To the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, be honor and glory forever," said the middle lines. "To God alone, to Jesus Christ, be honor and glory forever," was thrice repeated, east and north and west, below. The words were part in praise, part in apology. The beautiful tower was forbidden by the ancient regulations of the order. The Cistercian chapel was to have but a modest tower, rising no more than a single story over the roof. These high parapets were a symbol of the pride of life. They indicated that the ambitions of the outer world had successfully invaded the monastery. "Not so," cried the abbot who built them, repeating again and again in great letters on the tower the assertion that it was raised solely for God's glory. In the south transept, out of which, in the southwest corner, stairs led up to the dormitory of the monks, the chapel, which was originally the middle one of three, was turned into a sacristy, and a narrow door in the south wall gave access to a large room built against the chancel, which may have been the office of the sacrist. In the sacristy, and in other safe places, were kept the abbey treasures. Here were the copes which the monks wore when they went in procession on great days. At the time of the suppression, when an inventory was taken, there were 80 of them. 6 were made of cloth of gold, 26 of white damask, 4 of white velvet, 2 of white fustian. 5 old copes were of embroidered work, and 6 of flowered work. One was, quote, very well wrought with images, end quote. One, wrought with images, was of green damask. 6 were of red silk, worked with flowers and stars. One was of black velvet. Some of these splendid cloaks may have been given by noble benefactors out of their own wardrobes, for Richard of the Lionheart presented to the prior of Durham his parliament robe, quote, of blue velvet, wrought with great lions of pure gold, end quote, whilst Queen Philippa, making a visit to Ely, gave the prior her, quote, jewelled robes of state, powdered with golden squirrels, end quote. Here also hung surplices and Eucharistic vestments of cloth of gold and silk and velvet and serge. Here the abbot may have kept his 2 mitres, one for common days, the other for high feasts, but both of them shining with plates of silver and garnished with pearls. Each had its cushion, a word which the writer of the inventory laboriously spelled, quote, Qweshan, end quote. Here were processional crosses, chalices and patens reserved for great festivals, shrines to be borne about the church on the festival of Corpus Christi, one containing a rib of St. Lawrence, another a bit of St. Anne's scalp set in a plate of silver, and an image of St. James, and another of Our Lady, both of silver gilt, a table, or reredos, for the high altar at great services, bearing 3 images of silver gilt, embellished with gold and precious stones, and, most precious of all, a cross of solid gold, set with gems, and having in it a piece of the true cross of Calvary. The chapel of 9 altars had 7 of these holy tables against its east wall, the 3 which would naturally have stood under the great window being combined into one. Each altar had its aumbry, or closet for the sacred vessels, and was parted from its neighbor by a low barrier of wood, while a similar wall ran along the front of the whole row, with doors admitting to the altars. There was a gallery over the altar screen which parted the chapel from the presbytery, and a little gallery over the door in the southwest corner, which was connected by a long overhead passage with the abbot's lodgings. It is likely that at Fountains, as at Durham, there was a closet against the south wall, where at the time of saying Mass the sacristan provided the monks with bread and wine for their various altars. Having thus examined the church, we may imagine ourselves at service in it upon some high occasion. The lay brothers in their brown gowns are in their stalls. The monks are in their places in the choir. They are dressed in white woolen cassocks tied with a black girdle, and have over breast and back a scapulary, a straight breadth of black cloth before and behind, the two pieces fastened at the shoulders. Over this plain garb, each monk now wears one of the gorgeous copes of the sacristy. There are 2 candles on the high altar, and behind them is the tablet with the 3 images, probably our Lord on the cross, with St. Mary on one side and St. John on the other, with, quote, beads and plate of silver gilt and some part gold and set with stones, end quote. Back of the altar, suspended high against the screen and falling to the floor, is a tapestry hanging of arras work. The holy table is spread with white damask embroidered with flowers. On a shelf in a carved recess of the south wall are a basin and ewer for washing the priest's hands, a boat-shaped vessel for incense with a spoon, 2 cruets, a pair of silver censers, and a chalice and a paten for the bread and wine. Over the head of the celebrant, as he prays, hangs a silver basin in which burns a candle. All these things were in the abbey when the final inventory was made. Thus the service begins, the commemoration of the supreme self-sacrifice. The smoke of incense drifts across the light of the east window, and there is a sound of chanting, imploring, adoring voices. Hands are outstretched to receive the mystic bread and wine, and presently they go out to undertake again their homely tasks in the name of Him to whom belong the Church and themselves. To these repeated acts of worship, the monks came with a faith which asked no questions. The services, it is true, were very frequent, and human nature was with them what we know it to be with us. The thoughts of the brethren would sometimes wander, and the devout words would be words only. They were of our own kin and kind. Thomas Kidd and Lawrence Ben, and Henry Jackson and John Walworth and their fellows who were here at the time of the suppression had their bad and their good, as we have, and in about the same proportion. They were trying, the best way they knew, to magnify the good, to make the ideal real, and to gain the approbation of God. In the church they found assistance. There it was, with doors open day after day, its aisles fragrant with holy associations, as with the incense of the prayers of the saints, its shining altars, its appealing music, its mute assurance of divine nearness. To it they brought their trials, their perplexities, their hopes, their aspirations, their resolutions. It was the house of prayer and the sanctuary of blessing. It was the heart of their life.